all the faculty, staff, students of Symbiosis School of Economics, I, Urvashi Dhingra, extend a very warm welcome to all our dignitaries on the dais. Mr. Pradeep Bhargav, Chair for today's track, all the speakers, Dr. Rakesh Basant, Professor Smita Srinivas, Dr. Sunil Mani, and Mr. Janat Nabar, all distinguished guests present in the gathering, and our Vice Chancellor, Dr. Rajni Gupte. Thank you all for coming together to this curtain raiser event of the Conference on Future of Employment, Challenges and Opportunities. SSE has completed 10 years since its inception in the year 2008. And to commemorate these 10 years, this conference has been instituted as a biennial feature with the aim of addressing one of the most pertinent socio-economic issues of present times, employment. Over the next 2.5 days, this conference will have discussions on various facets of employment, with many eminent speakers giving their thoughts on employment challenges of today and explore opportunities that need to be created to overcome them. Throughout the conference, you may tweet your comments on our handle, #FECO 2019. May I now request our Vice Chancellor, Dr. Rajni Gupte ma'am, to please share her opening remarks.
A very good evening to all of you, members on the dais over here and the audience. The School of Economics has this conference, spoke about this conference to me many months ago. And when Dr. Jyoti and her team explained the theme of the conference, I was delighted that yet again another institute of the university is launching a theme or talking about a theme which is so dear to all of us. At the university, we lay great store on all the institutes preparing our graduates beyond the classroom. And when I say this, I really mean that the students need to get exposed to what happens beyond the classroom by having people from all walks of life coming and addressing them. And conferences like this, which are a feature in each of the institutes of the university, actually provide an opportunity to do so. When I look at the kind of topics that are discussed in the Festival of Thinkers, where we have maybe politicians, where we have people from the sports field, a large number of people who come and talk to the students, I think that provides an opportunity for our students to go beyond what the curriculum tells them. I'm delighted that Dr. Jyoti has put together a very, very interesting theme, and with tracks which are so very relevant in the discussions that all of us read in the newspapers every day. Whether technology is creating jobs or taking away jobs. What is the informal sector really all about, and are we counting the jobs that the informal sector creates? Each of the themes that she has created or her team has created are enough food for thought, and I think this curtain raiser was a great idea to get people who are sitting here on the dais to set the ball rolling for this discussion. As a university, I think I must also mention to you some of the key things that we have been in the last few years focusing on. One is that we have set up several research centers. As a university, initially we were known for the Faculty of Management and the Faculty of Law. But over the last 8 or 10 years, we have turned our attention to biomedical sciences, we have turned our attention to health and medical technology, and engineering. In this context, we have recently set up research centers in stem cell science, stem cell research, nanoscience and nanotechnology, medical image analysis, thereby stepping into domains which were earlier not there in the university. This has helped to improve the research profile, and a huge amount of resources are going in to build a hospital at the university campus. Tomorrow I know the conference will be at the university campus, and as you go up the hill on the right hand side you will see a beautiful university hospital coming up, which will be a 250 bedded hospital. It's a research center, and it will be, we hope in the future, to build something like a health science technology park, where we hope there will be companies incubated on the campus, companies located on the campus, who will provide internship opportunities to students, in turn helping in the process of incubation, for which the Department of Science and Technology has given us a grant as a technology business incubator. So these are new initiatives at the university. Just as the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences is blooming, we hope that the Faculty of Health and Biological Sciences will also take wings and provide the same kind of exposure that management and law have given us in the earlier years. Once again, let me compliment Dr. Jyoti and her team, and I'm sure all of us are very eager to listen to the thoughts of the speakers. Mr. Bhargav, thank you so much for agreeing to be with us. I know you have a very, very busy schedule. I'm glad that you are here to set the ball rolling on this. Other panelists, thank you so much for being here. Other speakers who are in the audience, all our partners, I once again thank each one of you for your support to the Symbiosis School of Economics. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Our today's track is on productivity, technology, and innovation. And our knowledge partner for this track is Center for Technology, Innovation, and Economic Research, STEER. So, without further ado, I hand over the stage to our track chair, Mr. Pradeep Bhargav, President, Maharashtra Chamber of Commerce, Industries, and Agriculture, to carry on with the proceedings of this track, sir.
Yeah, that's right. Rajni, Jyoti, distinguished faculty, my colleagues on the panel. First thing, to compliment Symbiosis for starting on time. You know, quite often I reminded of some of those ST buses which start only when the bus is full. So we didn't wait for the thing, we're starting on time. That's a compliment. Thank you so much for doing that. It's a courtesy that we extend to the people who have come on time. Now, straight away, we are supposed to do curtain raiser. I'm wondering, I work on the board of a company called Himmat Sikka, which makes draperies, and they're saying curtain ka business has come down. There are no curtains now. Where is the curtain today? There's so much transparency. There is RTI. There is open book. There is an open sourcing. There's just about everything is open. So what this curtain is all about, it's interesting. All the same, thanks for bringing this out. And it is credit to Symbiosis that in spite of all this transparency also, they are going to reveal to us in the next 2.5 days some amazing jewels. You'll get a sample today of the people who have got amazing record. And I think that's what the curtain opener is all about, with the best jewels that we have. Thank you so much, my panelists, colleagues, to be here. I consider myself to be a part of Symbiosis, and Rajni knows that. And she thanked me for coming. You know, I have come all the way from Pune, 2 blocks away is my office. I think we should be thankful to people who have come from Trivandrum, Banglore, Ahmedabad. And so I really thank you so much for coming all the way here. Every time you raise the curtain, then you start raising issues. That's what the purpose of this 2.5 days is. So certainly my panel will also raise the issues. And I think it's important. But my panel will also do something more. Besides raising issues, they will express, reveal, unravel, not only the diagnostics as to what is happening in this because of productivity, technology, innovation to the employment. It's easy to do, you know, pathological tests, biopsy, and all the stuff that they do, analysis which researchers do, but you'll also be coming out with some solutions which will help create an environment, an input for the policymakers, for the academicians, as well as for the implementers, operating people like me, to bring an equitable, sustainable, brighter, and hopefully economically and socially sustainable environment. So that's what it is. So now the last thing on this curtain raiser, the only thing I'm nervous about this curtain raising is my gross recognition of my gross inadequacy to be with all these people. I'll tell you why I'm saying it. I'm not just being polite. Dr. Rajni Gupte comes and talks. Dr. Jyoti will talk after that. Dr. Rakesh Basant is going to talk, and Dr. Smita and Dr. Everybody is going to talk. So what am I doing? In all these doctors, I feel like a compounder, who is just not the capability of the thing that has to do, but I felt that I'm very ill-qualified to be with these doyens, but I will still try and do. So when I told Jyoti, why are you getting me? Get some another doctor. She said, no, aajkal zamana reservation ka hai. So everywhere there's a reservation, so UGC guidelines says you must have a senior citizen also in your panel, so it doesn't matter if he doesn't understand academics, you should have somebody who thinks so. Please forgive me, we'll go ahead with this. Now, I think having said that, my colleagues and I, we had a little discussion prior to our meeting, and we promised you two things. A, we'll finish on time because you'll start getting the smell of the food. So it's very, very injurious to health when you get the smell of the food and you can't drink, so we'll finish on time, and that's our understanding. Whatever time Jyoti is given, we'll do. Secondly, we'll try and make it as interactive as we can. It's not series of speeches, but it's going to be engagement, and I think I would seek your indulgence as we get on to this thing because it's important. So my sequence would be, since I'm here, I have to say something, so I will set the context, 5 to 7 minutes. My meter had started already as soon as I came, and it's not 5 minutes from now. These four colleagues of mine are going to be given 10 to 12 minutes each, and I'm sorry, it almost sounds like a headmaster's way, but they've agreed to, they'll be given 10 to 12 minutes each to give their point of view. No bias, no nothing. Though with your permission, I'll give a little poser before you start. After that, and that's interesting, they'll all be alert like you will be. After that, each of the panelists is going to ask a question or respond to a point made by the other panelist. They can choose what point and which panelist. So we're going to have this very interesting, each of the persons are going to ask somebody else or react to something. So that's going to take us a thing. After that, we'll keep by then, we'll start smelling and hearing. We will have question and answers, and after that, if you ask more questions, it's on your account, not my account. So we just want to finish everything on time. Is that a fair process? So we'll just go by this, and we'll get on to this. So my 2 minutes points of setting the context, and I do want to make some point out here. I tried to undervalue myself, but I do have 4 decades plus experience in manufacturing industry, employment-oriented, domestic, international, public sector, private sector, consumer, industrial, B2B and B2C market, and have been in high-tech areas like consumer electronics, and I've been dull, boring things like power generation equipment, not very exciting. And believe me, these topics, a lot of people say, what will you talk about innovation, purane ho? But productivity, technology is always been a part of life. Haven't you all gone through it? So have we. But the word innovation is of a recent origin. We used to use the word like development, evolution, research. Nothing as cool as innovation, incubation, startup. All these terms have been coined in recent times. But we also used to do something which was called development and things. So, having said that, the only other difference is in our time we used to talk about creating IP, intellectual property. These days, this innovator create IPO. They look at IPO before they look at IP because that's the way the business model has changed completely, and so that's the time. Coming to something serious, I'm going to make 3 background points and 2 substantive points. The first background point I want to make, guys, recall, productivity, technology, and development have been subject of seminars and conferences like this for decades together. When 1.0 was there, I don't know, but 2.0, 3.0, they've always been there. But what was our discussion that time? How will technology and productivity and innovation help growth? How will they help development? How will they increase the security of the nation, social security or national security? We used to talk about human index going up. We used to talk about all the positive things, including things like ethical and income distribution. We used to talk about all those things in this context. So there's nothing new about these 3 being the change agents. However, we never used to talk about these things affecting employment, because the theme and the general history has been, every time they've gone for technology innovation, of course they've changed the complete quality of employment complex of the workforce. But always what was added was much more than what was replaced. So always with technology and productivity and innovation, there has been a phase in all the way till recent times where the number of new employment used to be more than the number of employment displaced. Of course, you had to go for reskilling, etc. This is the first time in recent times we are discovering that technology, productivity, and innovation are creating some kind of employment. Of course they do, because in AI you need different times, machine learning you different skill. But the number of people they're likely to displace is much more. So that's one thing which has happened, like dy by dx has become negative in terms of growth, and that's one impact which we need to be cognizant of. The second backup point is, and because linked to this, is today job and employment has become the common theme of political ideologies. They've become common theme of everybody, not only as we talk about jobless growth. ILO is doing a great study on future of work, so everybody is talking about job employment much more than economic growth, and I think think tanks are thinking a lot about this. And the other point which I think come out in this, etc., there is of course a job crisis, but it looks like there's a more bigger crisis of job data crisis. We are debating so much on job data, what is actual employment, etc. I've been on 2 panel discussions, live TV, where it was on employment. Other times they were discussing of what is the correct data of aspirations. Talk to a lot of youngsters today. You talk to them about PF, they say we don't want PF deduction, I don't know how long I'll be there. You talk about gratuity, forget gratuity, give me pay today. Whole lot of people are also not interested in a permanency job, they're looking at new opportunities, new experience. So let's not get employment is PF, EPFO data, or employment is appointment orders. Employment is today, jobs have got to be looked at on a larger context of Rojgar in terms of things. So with this, I would want to again welcome my panelists. I was supposed to be only an appetizer. I've taken part of the main course, so I take your thing. Oh, but what, you have to look at this for so long? Please, you can remove this afterwards. So with this, I welcome you again and we'll get on to the thinking. So the first speaker, my choice or? Yeah, so I think we need to be courteous and proper. So Smita ji, could I request you to come across here? And as you think, I will put you up for that later on. Go ahead.
You know, I have a good ribbing that I'm always doing with a colleague from Pune about which city is nicer, and I'm afraid I have to go back and say that I think Pune beats Bangalore hands down. So I think he's going to gloat, but I should let him gloat on this one. So thank you very much for having me here. It's very courteous of all of you to have invited me, and let's see if we can pull this up. Okay. So we've sort of devised a slight division of labor on the panel. So I'm going to take the liberty of actually starting with a little bit of the conceptual framework that I think is helpful to think about some of the recent advances in economics. And the question I've sort of set up here is really whether a certain kind of evolutionary economics of innovation has passed India by. And I'm setting that up really as a bit of a provocation, because it's very easy, and we've been having a discussion in India about innovation for a very, very long time, and yet when I look at the methods that people use or the kinds of theories that people are using, in a way it's as if the last 30 or 35 years of economics didn't happen. And this is really where a lot of evolutionary perspectives have come into focus. Can you hear me in the back? I'm competing with the wind here. So a lot of economics has changed over the last 3 decades or more. And it's a bit of an opportunity. So what I thought I would do, at TC Lab and in some past and ongoing work looking at cross-industry data, we're actually looking at quite a lot of quantitative work and certain simulations to try and understand how industries and kind of history and development-friendly models play out. So today I'm not going to spend any time on that quantitative data, but I thought I would lay out maybe a couple of the more visual, conceptual ways of thinking that maybe we could have a conversation about. So if you look at, let's see if I get this right. The point made, which is really that this title of our panel is Productivity, Technology and Innovation, and as all of you I'm sure would agree, there's no single model that assumes there's a one-to-one relationship between the three of these terms. And it is very model dependent and theory dependent that actually puts them all in one bucket. So I'm not going to focus really on productivity at all, but maybe lay out some ideas for technology and innovation. Now, the history of technological learning says very clearly that learning is very messy. It's long-term. It takes place in complex environments. So one of the things that we really look at is how learning evolves across countries. And one of the challenges has been that, in a way, the models that we've used to inform policy discourse in India has been quite conservative. And we can debate that a little bit in the discussion. If you actually look at cross-comparative indicators of productivity and innovation, many of what we use are quite old, quite staid, quite conservative in many respects, and they come from the traditional indicators of science and technology policy, really what we think of as kind of the Frascati manual and the Oslo manual. And this is quite difficult because it doesn't really capture the tensions of learning. These are kind of buckets of information that have to capture a lot of dynamics, and they do so somewhat poorly. And one of the ones that, for better or worse, of course, has come to us has been the linear model, the so-called linear model. And we know it's a bit of a fiction that Vannevar Bush in the post-World War II years came up with this idea that we really have some kind of relationship between pure science and economic value. And unfortunately, this sort of framework has stuck. And it's stuck really because I think economists and statisticians sort of love this model. It captures so much, it says so little in some respects, and it's tempting to use and reuse. So we end up having basic research, applied research, R&D measures, questions of prototyping are difficult, for example, to stick into any of these buckets. You have very traditional investment indicators and so on. And we imagine, like Mr. Bhargava was saying, we imagine that there is kind of a corporate R&D firm where there's an R&D function which looks a certain way, the lab exists, the personnel exists, and this imagination really has driven us quite far. And if you look at the Jaipur Foot, for example, which is on screen, it doesn't really fall into this category of modeling at all. In fact, it's precisely these kinds of models where you look at innovation. They're not easily high-tech, low-tech. They don't easily fall into the traditional buckets of indicators. And we know there's been, if you actually look at these innovations, I'm a bit of a geek. Like many of you, my first degrees were in the sciences. So I come out with a lot of interest in how people think in labs. How do they prototype? What kinds of materials do they use? And so on. And so one of the questions is really, when we look at actual innovations, whether it's instruments, whether it's particular panels, whether we think of repair, how do people pull in materials, how do they model this function, we find that actually these things look very unlike what most of our indicators capture. And you could say it's not just the Jaipur Foot. If you don't want something low-tech, you can also take something like 3D prototyping. You could actually look at germplasm studies in agriculture. You could look at transport systems, and you would be hard-pressed to find something that looks like the indicators we use. Now, I just want to be agent provocateur here a little bit and say that really it seems from a kind of political economy standpoint, only one person here who looks a little bit like the mic has influenced the debate about learning and work in India. And I find that a bit disappointing. And I think many of you, given your training, will recognize all of these people. And maybe we should kind of have a raffle about if there's anyone here who didn't get all of these people. But the guy on the left, the hairy guy on the left, has disproportionately, I think, influenced the debate, which means that despite the richness of the models, it's not really a learning-based framework. So Marx can take us a certain distance, and extensions, sort of neo-Marxian models can also take us some distance. But the complications are that we really need something quite Schumpeterian to get further. And of course, many of the other economists here have spent quite a bit of time trying to understand this variety. So the moment you say that you need something which has evolutionary characteristics, you must pay attention to variety of institutions and organizations, changes across time, and you must have some metric to start saying T equals 0 begins here. Because that's the way in which we understand whether a subsector is actually doing the work you imagine it's doing. And so cross-country studies become very, very important. Now, one of the reasons we kind of bookend in policy the two extremes is because they're easy to bookend. We can say, should we let 1,000 flowers bloom, or should we pick winners? But this is a bit of a fiction, because of course there are all kinds of choices in between in terms of policy. And the Schumpeterian business cycle, of course, is not really a class-based business cycle. It has all kinds of different permutations in which the public and the private sector come together. And who, in fact, extracts the rents and how those rents are negotiated becomes a critical part of the model by which you decide whether diversity and inclusion actually pull together. So the growth theories of firms, the point was made earlier that the theories of growth have to capture not just the sector or the growth of industries, but they must also cover different kinds of work within those sectors, so including own account. And the Schumpeterian model, of course, at one level is, in a quite utopian way, an own account story. It's a story of a kind of an entrepreneur, and there's, a windfall rents to be had and so on in terms of profits. But you could imagine that growth story has to better connect with the evolutionary model. So just running through a couple of very sort of visual clues to some of the things we're looking at in terms of the quantitative studies, and I'll run through this very quickly. We're really trying to say there are really four kinds of evolution, what I call the 4 Cs. The first one gets an awful lot of attention from policy, which are cross-country convergence indicators. We're obsessed with saying, is India like China? Are we like Brazil? Is Brazil like Nigeria? Right? This is fun. So we spend a lot of time on these, and we start looking at very particular kinds of indicators: manufacturing value added, R&D, patents, publications. Now, by themselves, there's nothing wrong with this. The problem is that it becomes harder and harder to see what would be crisp, sort of comparable cases across countries. The moment you start looking at industries, sectors, products, and processes, this cross-country comparison looks even more fictional. So you could say, well, there are other kinds of challenges. From a political economy standpoint, there are many different pieces to your economy, so you have to have some kind of cohesion and actors that can ensure that cohesion. So you could imagine that this cohesion is intra-industry or inter-industry. But you also need to, if those two are really at the macro level and the meso level, you imagine at the micro level, from a kind of an innovation and design standpoint at any rate, you need something which looks a little bit more like the other 2 Cs, which are customization and cognition. So I won't dwell on this, but I'll just give you a couple of examples. If you look at the health industry across time, if you imagine, I don't know that you can see this, but the top one basically says you might split any sector into kind of the production elements, the demand elements, and the delivery elements, really the service piece of it. And if you look at the sort of the 2 Cs of convergence and cohesion, you can imagine that you can track your evolution across time depending on where the specialization of your particular country industry lies. So if you look at pharma, for example, you see a particular pattern of evolution, and the Indian case really is one where industrial production is very strong in generic pharma, but this picture doesn't really hold very much the same for diagnostics, for instance. So your subsector dynamics become quite interesting to see whether or not, in fact, your cohesion and convergence play out? And I'm happy to take questions on this as we proceed. So if you take the same figure and you say, just put it in table form, you can see that there's certain kinds of policy domains that come into conflict. The most obvious one being that industrial policy and health policy don't play out in any predictable way across those domains. So you might have industrial production when it has no clear lead from health policy, might end up with some of the problems we know we have in the pharmaceutical industry. On the other hand, vaccines are a good example where health policy really does lead certain kinds of characteristics and industrial policy follows. And if you look across countries, you start seeing that particular policy instruments then play out in very particular ways. These are really kind of just the conceptual, visual ways of thinking about what you're running in terms of either your simulation or other kinds of quantitative work. So these countries, we would be very tempted to say, India sounds like Brazil in terms of the health industry, but you would be wrong when you start looking at some of these characteristics. And this last one is across democracies, non-democracies, non-suppliers, or countries that were suppliers that then become non-suppliers. Here's another quick way to do it. If I have another minute, you can split the world between advanced industrialized countries and developing countries, and you can ask the second two C's. You can say you have customization and cognition as your lens through which you try and understand the evolution. And you might say that the bulk of our industrial policy has tended to be historically in the realm of the upper left-hand quadrant. That is, problems for which solutions have been searched for and found in advanced industrial countries, such as cars. Cars would be an easy example. They've solved a particular problem somewhere else, and we modify that car pretty much in minor terms, and we focus that industry in, say, an India or a Zimbabwe. But the off-diagonal elements then become particularly interesting from a developmental standpoint. So innovation's relationship with development becomes quite acute in these off-diagonal elements. And countries don't begin in any one place. They may actually begin, if you like, t equals 0 could be in one of these other quadrants. So they may not always begin in the same place. And you can imagine that you either deepen your quadrant capability or you move between quadrants. And just to give you an example from Banglore, which is much more a way of thinking about the relationship between production capability and an urban context in which you want to see demand and delivery drive the innovation. So this is like the triad I showed you, but here it's not production driven out of a lab that comes at you. This is a way of soliciting demand and delivery from the ground up in order to drive the innovation. This is something where I actually was I was one of the co-founders of this initiative, and we ran it as a kind of probably one of India's first and largest urban competitions as a way in which to imagine what this might look like. And you could imagine from an economic standpoint, you could run neighborhood, maybe diversity experiments of some kind as a way in which to think of your model. So the paths ahead, maybe I will leave this for the discussion and the debate, but both the triad and the quadrants are ways not just of doing quantitative work, but really a way to emphasize that an evolutionary model or models upend some of the traditional ways in which we think of winners or losers with respect to specific technologies. And they also offer, I think, a bit of a methods provocation about what might be mix and match methods we could teach more systematically in economics for the next generation. Because I have a hunch that what we're teaching is really at odds with some of the sector realities. Thank you.
Thanks, Smita. This great thing was meant for me, and they gave it to you because it should have been. Thank you so much. I think you did bring the 4 C's, and the 5th C being the collaboration between all our panelists into this. So I'll request Janak to come and talk. And one of the things, friends, notice we are not spending no time in introducing people. We're putting on the screen because people come here to listen to you, not listen about you. So that's the format.
I'd like to thank which one? Professor Chandiramani and her team at Symbiosis School of Economics for inviting us to be a part of this track, and also the speakers Smita Srinivas, Rakesh Basant, Sunil Mani for coming all this way, and thank you Pradeep for agreeing to chair this track. So I'm going to be speaking about indicators from a publication that we've recently come out with. It's the Steer Handbook Technology and Innovation in India. They are traditional indicators, so Smita, I'm going to start with the traditional indicators, but hopefully veer towards some of your customization ideas that you talked about. But before I delve on this, I wanted to just cover a few points which most of us know. India for some time has had this goal of raising its share of manufacturing output in GDP to 25%. We wanted to get R&D as a percent of GDP to 2%. It's been stuck in a range of 0.6 to 0.9% for nearly 3 decades. And we also know that private sector just does not spend enough on R&D and innovation in India. In fact, it's so heavily concentrated globally as well, but in India, about 220 firms that we track cover 90% of industrial R&D in India today. And we did this exercise where we looked at, if we mandated these companies to spend as a percent of their sales, levels of, global sector R&D intensity levels, if they were to spend that much, and even if you got government ministries to actually set aside 2% of their budgets, there was no way that we'd reach even 1.5% of GDP. So this 2% goal, it's a good goal, but it seems elusive at the moment. And so this might call for, a fresh approach and a new thinking in terms of maybe sectoral opportunities. And using this data, I'd like to identify a couple of opportunities. But before that, I want to share the structure of industrial R&D in India today. We see there are some similarities, clearly in terms of the sectors. There's heavy concentration in pharmaceuticals and biotechnology and automobiles and parts. But we're absolutely very little R&D or no R&D happening when it comes to sectors like electronics or even technology and hardware. And this becomes even more evident in the slide that follows, where we've looked at the presence of Indian companies in the list of the top global 2,500 R&D spenders list. And again, here you find that the concentration is largely in pharma, automobiles, computer and software services, but absolutely lacking when it comes to sectors like electronics, technology and hardware, or even healthcare equipment and services. So the first opportunity really, I think Smita talked about diagnostics, and I think that's an area where India really has the potential. We have an industrial base, given the competitive pharma industry we've had over these years. The previous slide, we saw that India has absolutely no presence in the R&D space when it comes to healthcare equipment. And really this is one area which, given the industrial base, given the demand for healthcare, the potential for technology deepening is huge. We know that there's preference for private healthcare over public healthcare. Diagnostic costs as out-of-pocket expenditure increasing. The whole debate of preventive versus curative. And so clearly if there's one opportunity, this would be the diagnostic medical devices space. The other great opportunity I think that we have is the fact that there's a lot of multinational R&D presence in India today. And I want to use the electronics sector as an example. This, greater integration of MNC R&D could apply to a number of sectors. But the reason I've chosen the electronics sector is because when I looked at the data on the patents that were granted by the USPTO, apart from a few companies in software services and like IBM or Symantec, you realize that bulk of these, and these are just the top 10, right? These top 10 have about 660 patents for about 8 companies. that are in the area of technology, hardware, and electronics, and electrical engineering. And so India doesn't have a company of global repute doing research on the global stage in this particular area, but we do have that research happening on Indian soil today. When you look at publications data, you find that India is the third largest contributor to electronics and electrical engineering publications. I mean, this kind of hit me, but it was interesting to note. And, citation impact aside, one of the things that really stands out is the fact that industry-academia collaboration is very low. It's actually the lowest in this group here. So the point is, if you have the possibility for greater integration of the MNC research that's happening in India with the university system, that clearly will have implications for those entering the labor market. There are also studies like BCG and Capgemini that have come out with surveys that talk about the adoption of AI in India, and India is supposedly one of the early adopters and also adopting it on a wider scale that goes beyond just the pilot phase. I suspect that this is largely due to the presence of these MNCs that are there on Indian soil. And so if there's a way to, again, connect our local firms with a lot of these multinationals in a way that the firms become part of these global value chains, clearly that's going to help increase our competitiveness, but also have implications for, again, employment. I'm going to end here with a slide just on startups. And the point here is that if we really are thinking about technology deepening from the manufacturing route, bulk of the funding is going to sectors like e-commerce, consumer retail, and there's very little linkages with the manufacturing sector. I mean, this is great if we're creating jobs, but my concern really here is about the sustainability of many of these startups in the services space. And somehow, I think we have to create those linkages and work towards creating stronger linkages with the manufacturing sector. That's the route we want to take. So, I'm going to stop here, and I hope I've stuck to less than 10 minutes. Okay, great. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Janak. And it's interesting, he brings out pharmaceutical industry by investment. One of the reasons being investment in R&D has not only been able to create huge export opportunities, and his first cousin called equipment, healthcare equipment, is depending on imports and there is no investment. It's bizarre because the same market in India, which is served so beautifully by the pharmaceutical industry, is in the healthcare. And you're working on that, so I think there needs to be some diagnostics of that industry itself. So next I'm going to request Sunil, Dr. Sunil Mani to talk about it. Come.
Yeah, first of all, I wish to thank the Symbiosis School of Economics for giving me a chance to come here. My paper is actually very much spot on the theme of this overall conference, which is actually looking at the future of employment. Now, in year 2013, there was a very important and influential paper which was published from the Oxford Manton School, which talked about the fact that the future of employment is going to be very difficult. And in fact, it measured the degree of automatability of a number of occupations. And in fact, some people have used that data to show that almost like 69% of the jobs in India are going to be automated. And given the fact that, as Janak referred to the Make in India program or the manufacturing strategy of the earlier years, where we want the size of our manufacturing sector to be almost like 25% of the GDP by year 2020, which is just a year or two from now. And this is happening at a time when manufacturing technologies all over the world are increasingly getting automated. And so that's very bad news for India in terms of trying to create manufacturing, trying to create employment through the manufacturing route when manufacturing technologies are becoming automated. Now, what I would like to do is to see whether, based on data, because lots of the statements which are made during this on this particular aspect is based on impressions and all kinds of speculations and so on. So, can we say something with actual data on automation, and will automation, for instance, affect manufacturing employment in India? Because all the speakers, especially the chairman, has also referred to the fact that we do have a problem with reference to employment. Whether you agree with the National Sample Survey data or not, economists have been actually pointing out that the labor intensity of India's manufacturing has been coming down. And in fact, even the labor-intensive sectors, like for instance the cotton, textile, food processing, etc., and so on, have themselves been becoming much more capital-intensive over time. So we have been referring to a kind of a jobless growth. The economy is growing, but not enough jobs are actually being produced. So I think it's very important for us to then now look at whether this automation technologies are actually, or new technologies are actually going to reduce employment in the future. Now, when you talk about automation, it's not a homogeneous technology that we are talking about. There is a range of technologies. For instance, use of a forklift truck inside a factory or a conveyor belt is also a kind of an automation, but its employment consequences are quite different. On the other hand, if you talk about industrial robots, which is the highest form of automation that you can talk about, because robots can actually replace human beings because they are very flexible, they have arms, so they can pretty much do various tasks which human beings were actually doing. So let me actually define automation narrowly in terms of robots, because the Oxford Martin study and the later on studies which have actually come up in the West actually talked about there is a kind of a robot apocalypse, in the sense that robots are coming and people are going to lose their employment. So based on real data, whether one can make some kind of informed statements regarding this. Now, my presentation is pretty long, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to run through this in quite fast. The first point that I would like to make is that there has been a kind of, there are two things which one has to take into account. First is that studies have actually shown that if you automate your plant, you can reduce manufacturing costs by a significant amount. And this is, of course, varied from the stage of development that the country is in and so on. Second fact is that automation technologies themselves are becoming much cheaper. For instance, the cost of a robot has systematically come down over a period of time. So it's even possible for a small and medium enterprise, for instance, to purchase a robot and start using that at the plant level. And because of these two factors, that is the possibility of significant reduction in cost, and also the fact that automation technologies are becoming cheap and very much within the reach of even small and medium enterprises, you can expect a large-scale shift to automation in the future. And automation technologies, due to developments in artificial intelligence, are also becoming much more flexible, and so various kinds of tasks which we previously thought cannot be automated can now be automated. For instance, even in our own country, you can see that a number of service sector activities are now increasingly getting automated. That 1-800 number that you call, very often the human voice that you hear is actually from a robot. And so the customer interaction centers are increasingly getting automated, so it's happening right in front of our eyes itself. So what one has to do is to look at some data, and this data requires a certain amount of rigor. The first rigor that you require is that you need to have the operational stock of robots which are actually used. So you can't simply look at the supply of robots, which are the flow of robots which are happening during a particular year, and then make some comments. You have to know how many robots are actually used inside the plant, and then what is its effect on manufacturing employment. The second aspect of the rigor is that you need to have, if you take any kind of occupation, there are several tasks within those occupations, and it is only certain tasks which can be automated. So you require essentially task-wise data of where robots are going to be used. So by simply taking broad occupations and making some comments, you tend to exaggerate the effect of automation on employment, and that was the problem of the Oxford Martin study that I referred to. That study actually said that almost like 69% of the jobs in India are automatable, and that seems to be quite a wild estimate. And so, if one actually looks at the historical data on automation, there is a study which has actually been done by a Stanford economist by name Kenneth Flam, and he published this study in the year 1988. And this study actually has put together the data on, because robots are nothing new. They were actually used even in the 70s and 80s. We refer to robots as if something which has come up only in the 21st century. They were very much in existence even in the 20th century in factories in the Western Europe, Japan, and in the United States. And so if you look at the data on the use of robots within industries and within tasks within industries, Kenneth Flam shows a very important trend, which is common across Western Europe, United States, and Japan, because these were the three regions where robots were actually used in manufacturing plant. And what he found was that robots were essentially used in one particular industry in a very large numbers, and this particular industry is the automotive industry. The robot usage is basically a function of the size of the automotive industry in a particular economy. And of course, later on, some sort of diversification have happened. It has also gone into other industries, such as, for instance, the electronics electronics industry also. Wherever you have repetitive jobs where cognitive skills are not required, robots could actually replace human beings for doing that. For instance, making things in a circuit board. It will be the same kind of thing in every circuit board, so a robot can be used instead of a human being. And again, when he looked at the tasks within these occupations, what he found was robots were, for instance, in the automotive industry, which is the largest candidate for using automation technologies, he found that robots were largely used in one particular task, which is basically welding, and then, of course, in painting. And again, when you look at welding, it is not in the whole range of welding areas that these were being used, but basically in arc welding and spot welding. Now, the problem with arc welding and spot welding is that they are extremely human unfriendly, because a fair amount of heat is generated and the occupational hazards are extremely high in those particular areas. So traditionally speaking, robots were being used in those particular tasks. Now, we can look at very recent data, which has been thrown up by the annual surveys which are conducted by the International Federation of Robotics, because this is the only agency which is actually putting together data on use of robots within industries, within tasks, within industries, across countries over a long period of time. So you have now a long time series data, and their database includes India as well. So that becomes a sort of a interesting point to look at. So let's now look at the Indian data. Before I go into the Indian data, let me give you some broad. Broad numbers, and what you find is that the number of robots which are actually used has tremendously increased in worldwide, and you can see a very sharp increase, especially after the global financial crisis to almost like a spike in the trend which has happened. Now, if you look at the estimated the shipments of industrial robots by regions, largely it's concentrated in the blue bar, which is given there. With the blue bar is basically Asia. Now, you can immediately see that why Asia has become an important user of robots, because the geography of the automotive industry has shifted, and most of the automotive vehicles are now being produced by Asian countries like Japan, Korea, China, and now India as well. So if you look at the estimated operational stock of robots, that's largely concentrated in Asia. Of course, you still have some in Western Europe and in the Americas, but still much more in Asia. If you look at the country-wise, you find that China itself is the largest user of robots, because China's desire to become, to remain very competitive has forced the country to actually use a lot of robots, because, as you know, China has become the world's factory essentially through the labor arbitrage which that country possessed. And with the wage rates rising in China, they have now started using robots in a big way. Now, if you run through that list, you find that all the countries which are actually on that list are either countries which manufacture automotives in sizable numbers or electronics products in numbers. For instance, Taiwan doesn't manufacture that much of automotives, but basically electronics. Now, even a small country like, for instance, Thailand is actually using a lot of robots because, as you know, Thailand has become a kind of an automotive capital of Southeast Asia, manufacturing a range of automotive parts, etc., and so on. So the robot story is basically a automotive story. This is the point that I wish to make. So you can see that very clearly in the industry-wise distribution of operational stock of robots. So you will find that the automotive industry is actually the largest. Now, if we take a look at India, we can see that in India also the number of robots which have used have phenomenally increased. It was just about 70 in year 2000, and it has now gone up to almost like 16,000. So there is a kind of of course there is a low base problem here, but nevertheless there's a tremendous increase in the use of robots. Now, if you look at the industry-wise distribution, and I know this is a difficult graph to look at, but you can see that again it is basically the various manufacturing sectors at 3-digit levels, and you find that it's basically the automotive industry which is again the largest user of robots in India. And you can see that almost like 3/4 of the robots which are used in Indian manufacturing industry is actually in the automotive industry. Although the Indian automotive industry tends to use much more robots than in the share of the automotive industry in total robot usage is much more than in the other countries that we are looking at. And in fact, most of the robots are actually produced, robotic technology is actually also produced by the automotive companies. If you run through the list, almost all the companies which are in the top, which are actually producers of robots, are also automotive industry. So the basic point that I'm trying to say is that it's very clear that this is the particular industry which is actually going to use a lot of robots. Now, if you look at the effect on employment, the way in which you look at it is look at the density of employment of, for every 10,000 labor force, how many robots are actually being used. So the world average is something like 69. So if you look at India for that matter, it is only about 10. That is, if you take 10,000 people, there are about 10 robots which are being used, whereas the world as a whole, it's about 69. If you take 10,000 people, there are about 69 robots. But within the automotive industry in India, the density is much higher. If you take 10,000 manufacturing employment within the automotive industry in India, you have 54 robots being used, as against the average for the Indian industry as a whole of about 10. So the robot, and if you look at all the major manufacturers, they are themselves either installing robots, and as a result, in fact, if you look at the latest annual report of the Tata Motors, they say that they have turnover has increased by 250%, essentially because of the use of robots and so on. Now, again, if you look at the task-wise use of robots, even within India, you find exactly the same kind of picture which Kenneth Flam talked about in the case of United States, Western Europe, and Japan. Most of the robots are actually used in welding, and within that arc welding and spot welding. So my basic conclusion, to cut a long story short, my basic conclusion is that as of now, robots coming and taking away employment is just a myth. And it's based on kind of impressions, and it's not based on actual data. Now, after having said this, let me correct myself in one point, that robotic technology is developing so fast, and it is possible that in the future, and because there are 8 different complementary technologies which are developing in so fast, and in fact during discussions I can go into the details of that it is possible that many other tasks which we thought were not automatable in the past could be automated in the future. For instance, even making of a cloth, because the only aspect of making of a cloth that is automated now is actually the sewing part of it. And all other parts are still being done by human beings. So the recent study by ILO, for instance, that the robots are coming and all those labor-intensive industries are going to disappear, is actually a complete myth. And of course, with developments in certain kinds of technologies, for instance, the sew bot technology, which has been developed by an American company, it is possible that even a cotton textile industry in the future can be automated. But as of now, in 2019-20, we don't have nothing to fear. So that's all I have to say. Thank you. Thank you, Council.
Thank you, Dr. Sunil. When he started, I thought, and Jyoti was thinking of calling robots as speakers for the next seminar because this is a complete tutorial. Thanks for the reassurance in the end. So friends, I'm now, before I question, I just want to remind my panels, you have your questions ready at the end of this all. And don't make it a surgical strike, all asking the same person. So you got to be democratic about it. And you'll notice I can't get into their shoes. I'm getting into their chairs as the people are moving. So may I request Rakesh now to come and talk here.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak here. In a relay race, I think the last person has to make up for the time. So I'll try and be as brief as possible. I know that the topic of the conference is technology, innovation, and employment. And after our initial discussions on what this panel should be doing, I just decided to focus on a fairly narrow set of issues to highlight some dimensions of the links between productivity, technology, innovation, and employment. And my submission today is that it will be useful for us to look at this link between technology, innovation, and employment through the lens of what in the economics or innovation literature we call university-industry linkages. And I'll make a few general kind of comments which are more like hypotheses, and we can discuss those during the interaction kind of session. Now, what is the context of this discussion? The context is we have had, as earlier panelists pointed out, we have had decent industrial growth in recent times, but irrespective of how you measure productivity, various measures of total factor productivity tell you that it has not grown very rapidly. And in fact, after 2011-12, there has been a deceleration in the growth of productivity. And if you believe in the numbers which were put out somewhat more recently, there has been a negative total factor productivity growth in the last 2 or 3 years. And at the same time, while industrial growth has happened, it has not been labor absorbing, notwithstanding the issues around what kind of data should be used. Now, what is resulting in this kind of anomaly? You have a situation where growth is happening, productivity is not growing, but labor is also not being absorbed. Now, one obvious answer could be that firms are making wrong choices in terms of their investments. They are investing in technologies which are not the right ones for them. They are not resulting in higher productivity, nor are they absorbing labor. And on their own, they are not doing any technology effort which is enhancing efficiency. The other possible argument could be that firms are doing it because the kinds of skills that are available to them, whether to run the robots of some kind or do other kinds of activities on the shop floor or elsewhere, the skills that they need are not available. The university system or the education system is not creating the kind of skills that are required, and therefore the training costs of the firms go up, and they won't mind using more capital-intensive technologies because training labor that they hire is much more expensive. So it's very difficult to figure out what is happening in this whole process of the firms not hiring as much labor as they should be doing, given the kind of labor availability that we have in our country. Now, policy technology choices are very, very difficult to understand fully. I mean, we already heard earlier Smita talking about the conflict between health policy and industrial policy. Janak talked about trade policy, technology policy or industrial policy problems that you have. Pharma growing, but diagnostics or medical equipment not going because the trade policy is not conducive. So instead of getting into those dimensions which are very difficult to comprehend and even describe in 10 minutes, what I'm going to do is to just do a deep dive into the university industry linkages and ask this question: can we sort of get some insights on this through this endeavor? Now, very simply put, education, and particularly higher education and industry, are fairly intricately linked. Higher education institutions can supply research and other services, they can train workers, they can generate new knowledge and transfer that knowledge to industry. That knowledge can also result in creation of new enterprises which form the industry, and of course, most importantly, they provide skilled labor which is used by industry. And industry on the other side sells some kinds of goods and services to the education system. They can potentially supply teachers who have experience, who have practice experience, who can go and teach certain things which require hands-on experience. They can also provide knowledge which emanates from the R&D and technology generation activities that are done by industry. They can potentially fund startups which emanate out of education system. They can also provide support through mentoring, through providing complementary assets to take certain things to the market. And of course, they are the major users of labor, that are the skills that the education system produces. So you have this very intricate set of links that are potentially possible, but most of the data has shown that the linkages between university and industry are essentially labor market linkages. The other kind of linkages, as Janak pointed out, are quite weak. Now, before I get into a very small idea that I have, here are some numbers which are somewhat dated from the National Sample Survey 2004-2005. Using OECD classification, we divided industries into high-tech and high-tech industry and high-tech services. And what one finds that, let's not even look at the rural data, but if you look at the urban industry, of the total persons that a high-tech firm in urban area uses, only about 42% of their labor force is graduate and above. And 76.8% of them have no technical education. Technical education defined whether they don't have any diploma or anything like that. If you take all industries together, 93% of them have no technical skills that they have been given imparted. And if you take the proportion of graduates, only about 16.2% of them are actually employed if you take all industries together. But even if you use high-tech industries, the use of skilled labor, skilled as defined in the NSSO through the diploma and other technical degrees that they have, and graduate and plus, the participation is actually quite small as compared to the total workforce that is employed there. So clearly there is some kind of a mismatch there. Now, if you look at skills, you have two kinds of, broadly speaking, I'm not a labor economics person, broadly two kinds of skills. One, you have skills which are reasonably mundane, where you are supposed to do certain tasks which are repeated again and again, and you become skilled in that task and you do it well. It's a fairly monotonous task. And the other task is where you have to deal with ambiguity, you have to put things together, develop something new and innovative, or deal with problems which are somewhat more complex. Now, at one level, the education system is not creating the kind of skills which get employed in the industry and do those mundane tasks which are repeated again and again. At the same time, you also have a situation where higher education system is not doing any research to create the higher level skills, where you are creating something new. And so if you look at the data, less than 4% of the total R&D in India is actually done in higher education institutions. Bulk of the R&D is done by the public sector. And, and therefore, as a result, the linkages are essentially labor market, but there again, as I pointed out, the use of the graduates and skilled persons is fairly limited even in industry. So one can say that industry finds skills imparted by the education institutions quite inappropriate and inadequate to be hired. Now, for the higher end kind of skills, one can argue that the system that we have of higher education institutions today in India is such that there are very small or limited possibilities of people from different disciplines to come together and work on things. So in a large European or any Western university which is multidisciplinary, it's very common for different people from different disciplines to come and interact and sort of exchange ideas, work on things together and so on. So deal with a situation where multiple disciplines work together to solve kind of problems which also have a kind of market. Now even those institutions, and if I may say so, including an institution like Symbiosis, which has the possibility of bringing together multiple disciplines, it can be law, it can be economics, it can be design, it can be engineering, you have it all. But the silos are such that even in universities where a possibility of a multidisciplinary interaction exists, the silos are so deep and strong that nothing happens across these departments. And as a result, the higher end skills, which I call a combination of the left and the right brain, where design, technology, management has to come together, those kinds of skills are also not getting developed. Now, so if you look at the situation today, we have education institutions not creating knowledge, and they're not creating enterprises. Very few research institutions are there who are higher end and so on. So you have a very peculiar situation that industry is not getting engaged in curriculum. They are not interacting with the higher education institutions of various ways. Now, why is that happening? What is it that is resulting in this? I don't know for sure. I have a few hypotheses to share.
Rakesh, could you just tell me faster?
Yeah, one more minute. So one thing which I have is one of the critical things that we did incorrectly was to separate research and teaching fairly early in our evolution. CSIR labs were created, ICSR was created, universities were bereft of researchers. And as a result, that separation has continued, and we also have a system where most of the people get automatically promoted, and as a result, the pressure on them to do research and impart research-oriented skills are kind of limited. And because of the same reason, we don't see, despite the hype, we don't see a large number of startups coming out of these educational institutions. So there is a failure both at the high end of skills provision as well as the low end of skills provision. So if one wants to get into a situation where more people get absorbed at both ends of the spectrum, one will need to look at, in my view, look at the education system more squarely and figure out how to streamline the system to create the right kind of incentives for people to be much more research oriented and sort of much more multidisciplinary in many ways. I can come back to this on this idea later. One of the ideas that I have is that till we get to a system where we have large universities which can create these kinds of learning opportunities, there are clusters in India which have very interesting set of institutions which together can simulate a very good kind of environment for creativity. And if policy can facilitate these institutions to come together, I'm sure we will be able to generate skills, at least for the higher end kind of activities, which will give us much higher productivity in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rakesh. And you did hit the nail on the head by telling the entire fraternity that we know what's deficient. Some budgie has to make this marriage happen, but before going to the national level, maybe we can pilot it in few communities and few linkages on this. So friends, we've come to, we still got 10 minutes now. May I still go ahead, let each of these gentlemen who have prepared, lady who have prepared, very quickly. I'll start with you, Smita. Just choose, you don't even have to get, you just have to give an observation on who you talk about, and after that we'll open house. Come.
Can you hear me? Yeah. So one of the things, as I'm listening to my fellow panelists, the fun thing about these panels is, of course, you see them repeatedly in different ways. So you sort of also see each other's work move. So one challenge is in a very traditional model in economics, skills are relatively easily defined and categorized. And one of the challenges in some of the newer models is that skills are not so easily categorized. In the evolutionary sort of perspective, skills is kind of a combination of search and learning behavior that changes over time. You can put it into buckets, you can try and measure it, but the assumption is that search and learning behavior is borne by different organizations and institutions over time. And in the sort of more traditional models, skills, I don't want to say are easily borne by single institutions, but there's a bit of a question, who are they borne by? So this is for Rakesh, since we were debating this earlier just after breakfast. Who should bear these skills?
Yeah, I don't have, I don't think I have a very competent answer to this. But I know that defining these and measuring these skills is very difficult. We have been discussing this ad nauseum at the institution to say whether entrepreneurial skills are different from a managerial skill or but I think ultimately it's the job of both the employer as well as the supply and demand side of the story. So it has to be done jointly by the industry and the university system. And at this point in time, I think the university system has to take, in my view, take the first step and figure out how they can put together their heads and create skills which would be very useful for industry to take things to a level where a productivity and innovation levels go up dramatically. And of course, at the same time, the industry needs to recognize that these things can't happen in a day. And if they can create an environment for the universities to, in a sort of a medium term, generate these skills, that would make things faster. So the answer for me is that it has to be done jointly, but the first step, I believe, will have to be taken by the university system.
You're being very kind to the industry, but believe me, industry guys are the ones who create all this disruption. They are the ones who are the front end of creating. They should take as much a proactive lead as my submission we need to do. Would you have something?
More than a question, it's just a comment. I think what Professor Basant was talking about. Clearly, India just does not spend enough in higher education research. It's 4% globally. It's about 12%. I think the skills part really, Smita, if I may, the idea is that working alongside researchers. I think if there's more research funding allocated, and I think Pradeep, I agree with you that the private sector has to take the lead on this and invest more R&D in the university system, but also the public funding that has to be allocated has to increase. It's really the opportunity to work with good researchers. I think there are numerous skills that develop as a process of doing that. A quick question for Professor Mani. I was looking at the electronic sector as an example. If we have to leapfrog, given that we have no presence in the electronic sector, do you think adoption of robots in the electronic sector might help us create new opportunities and new avenues for diversification of our industrial base?
I think it depends very much on whether you have the manufacturing technology available for electronics production, because much of the electronics production is governed by intellectual property rights, and so it's not possible for you to insert into the global value chain for manufacturing. Let's say, for instance, smartphones. Can India, for instance, make smartphones, or can it only just assemble smartphones? Because we have neglected our R&D in telecommunications equipment by destroying a public laboratory which was set up in the mid-1980s. And now it is too late. Even if you come out with an electronic policy now, and it's a bit too late in the day to neither have we invested in creating local technologies in telecom equipments, for instance, as a subsector of the larger electronics industry, nor we have engineered spillovers from multinational companies to local companies. So, not having done this, just putting robots, but put robots where? You need to have the manufacturing capability first to put robots. So,
Okay.
On the other hand, I think the automotive industry is one industry which has actually been showing a great promise for India, and that's an industry where I think competitiveness can increase if manufacturing costs can actually come down, and because India has now become sort of a hub for manufacturing compact cars, for instance, and exporting that to other countries.
Sure. Thank you so much. Friends, I think we're conscious of the time. Any question that any one of you has the appetite for, please go ahead. Do identify yourself to be answered. I know I'm using the right words so that, yeah, go ahead. Which appetite is more? Yeah, there's a gentleman there. Yeah, please. There's a gentleman there. Oh, there also.
Yeah, I'm Sriraman, formerly of Mumbai University, Department of Economics. There's two questions. I don't know whether they're questions. But, Dr. Smita talked in terms of health policy and industrial policy. And I thought he said there was no industrial policy to really guide the health policy, or vice versa, whatever. I didn't follow that. That's fine. I'm not. I'm more concerned about, since I work in the transport sector. Let's look at transport policy. There has been really no transport policy framework for the country till now. Committees have been appointed, but a policy framework has been set up, but nothing has been really put into practice. It may be the case in many, many other sectors. But here, automobile industry, whatever the policy has been, has led transport sector, which is what is creating all the problems in the country, across the world, not only here. Similarly with the US, transport policy was not the leader for the automobile policy, but it vice versa. That's one question. And secondly, I'm not very sure whom I'm really asking this question. Everything has been about R&D, skills, etc. at the top. But what are we talking about skills at the bottom? A driver, one of the things that we are trying to find out today is we have an acute shortage of good trained drivers, truck drivers, bus drivers. Even our people, our youngsters who drive on the road, they are all not trained in any way at all to drive on the roads. That's why you see the number of road accidents that are taking place. Why are we not talking about that at all? Thank you.
briefly on this. I mean, I think the first one really is industrial and health policies have played, the point really was that the subsector of the health industry, the coevolution of health and industrial, and different countries have used strategically in different ways. One relationship between the two. But your point is correct, which is in sectors where there's an absence, perhaps, of sort of a strategic policy or a policy that dominates the outcome, you clearly have to have a different way of comparing. So one of the things I did not put out was the issue of, if you look at the 4 quadrants and you look at where problems are framed and where they are solved, the private automotive industry, the personal passenger car industry, is at odds with almost all our other efforts on other kinds of policies, whether they're urbanization or climate or health or you name it. So one of the questions is really whether those types of kind of visual modeled differently could lead us into something where these policy domains are not in obvious conflict. There will always be policy domains in conflict. The question is the degree to which, from a political economy standpoint, you can minimize it. I think that's really as far as anyone can think of.
Yeah, I mean, the point that you made was something which I was trying to say, that we have failed at both ends of the spectrum. I mean, whether the so-called low-end skills as well as the high-end kind of skills, and that's something which has to be addressed. So it has to be addressed collectively, and the industry has to pitch in to figure out which are the, I mean, they are doing it in polytechnics and things like that. But I'll go back to the skills issue which was raised by Pradeep. I still think that the private industry will be short-termish. They will look at immediate profits. But the universities will need to look at somewhat longer term and create some solutions which the industry finds useful. And my experience at the center, where we come up with interesting startups which have use in industry, they line up. Right? So
I just say, when private industry is ready to design product, ready to design processes, ready to design customer interface, they jolly well better do design things with respect to the skill they need. So I'm sure this is part of the logical cohesion in this. Yeah, there was a question at the gentleman there. Hey, this 5-star hotel doesn't have good microphones, so what? I mean,
agricultural implements, you take simple tools. And my question is, why doesn't it happen? Why don't those technological innovations, which often exist on the ground? I mean, Rakesh knows that. You know, here's the institution, Dr. Gupta put together thousands of them over a period of time. Why are they not put into practice? Why are they not absorbed? You know, we look really good at the talk, but why are we not looking at technological innovations which can improve productivity, improve life, and reduce arduousness?
I mean, that's a dialogue which has happened, including at PIC, on social innovations, grassroots innovation. Dr. Mashelkar talks about it. Multiple reasons, sir, I don't think we'll get into, but certainly financing becomes a major challenge. Most of our banking system is not equipped to look at this. They can understand NPV and long-term forecast calculation. They don't address it. That's one of the challenges. Secondly, I think the industry itself isn't entrepreneurship, doesn't have enough entrepreneurship to pick up those ideas which will have mass impact. I know there's a big deficiency, and I think the point that came also about driver skill, if somebody were to start, it will be doing. So I don't think we have an answer, and I'm not being apologetic about addressing high-end skill because that was the theme, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be looking at the low-end skills, most definitely. Yeah. Any other question, please? Yes, ma'am. Yeah, you can speak louder.
Yeah, we were just thinking, what about if industry as such, or company as such, starts an institute, like something like, to my mind, what comes is New Sigma University. If you know, there's a data science company called New Sigma in Bangalore, and they started this New Sigma University, where they take up graduates from social science and they train them on-job data science training, and they end up hiring some of them. And there's also Meghna Desai Academy of Economics, which is inside the hub of WTC Center. So what do you think about such institutes? Do you think those are also a kind of solution where industries are actually putting in fund into education and it will reduce the gap? Do you think so?
So there are certainly solutions, and there are solutions which are focused more on the immediate need of that particular firm or that particular industry. What I was saying that you should look at the industry linkages as one of the ways of solving this. But those kinds of initiatives will not solve the larger issue of creating skills which are not specific to a particular task or a particular industry. What I was trying to say was that for innovation, one requires skills which are multidisciplinary, and exposure to a large variety of things is always useful to deal with ambiguity. Even to work in a team which has a designer or a social scientist and an engineer and a manager in place is very difficult. And we simulate that in one of the courses at IMA. And when the team really works together, they find it tough to work with each other. So unless you create an environment where multiple disciplines are able to interact with each other seamlessly, those skills are unlikely to develop. But you're right. I mean, this is an industrial firm takes over a polytechnic and generates curriculum. Of course, that's a solution. But that's a solution for a particular segment. A larger solution is to have a university system which was broader in many ways.
I just want to add one point to that, which is just historically across countries, one of the big fights that comes out from precisely that interaction is the question of accreditation. And this goes back to the question of whether it's task-specific or not, and that's quite political.
So thank you. My name is Rajat. Thank you for the very rich discussion and a very diverse discussion. I have a question to Janak and to Rakesh, and maybe anybody from the panel could address this. And they've both lamented the share of R&D in GDP, and it's sort of obvious, the evidence is there to see that the share is very low. And my question has the same problem, I think, that the others have identified. I'm asking this question in a very sort of partial equilibrium framework, so not to deny the heterogeneity that exists in India. But none of you have actually spoken about the fact that India today is a sort of importer of intellectual property. And therefore, the intellectual property protection goes with the fact that India imports intellectual property. Over time, and Smita's talked about evolutionary economics, as India begins to export intellectual property and we become more sort of focused on creating it at home, do you think things will fall into place, that we will become the producer of intellectual property, because that will then serve our development needs. Right now, the weak protection serves our development needs, and over time, it could reverse. So what's the sort of, on intellectual property, is there some evidence on that?
I think
if you look at the technology balance of payments, clearly we are importing a lot of technology. There are a couple of issues which we've all grappled with actually as to what that constitutes. Now, are these patented technologies or are they copyrights and issues that serve the media industry? That's one thing. And if you look at the complementarity of R&D and imported technology, I don't think it's a very clear link that the sectors that are importing are also sort of doing R&D to complement that technology. So it's almost like it's substituting. I think there may be some overlap in some sectors like the auto industry, but by and large, when you do a sectoral breakdown, we weren't able to establish that necessarily complement. So even the learning by doing is, I mean, it's there to show that the data is there, but it's not very clear that that's exactly what is happening. I think, Sunil, maybe you would like to shed some light on this because I know that you like this topic.
Well, I think you need a correction here for the simple reason that when you look at the data on charges for the use of intellectual property rights, you have to make a distinction between patents and other forms of IPRs. So what India is actually importing is a lot of trademarks, designs, and other things, and not patents. And so that's the first point. The second point is that there has also been a feeling that because of the differential tax rates on say, for instance, dividends and profits, a certain amount of dividends and profits are being routed through surreptitiously through imports of IPRs, and this has been brought out by a number of independent studies, so the large negative trade balance that you see is a bit of a statistical artifact.
So they've said a couple of things which I wanted to say, but interestingly, if you look at the IP profile, we are not doing particularly great in terms of patenting and things like that. But if you believe in the numbers on innovation, the proportion of firms reporting innovation is significantly higher. I mean, whether you look at the World Bank survey or the survey that we are doing here, so obviously these innovations are not IP driven, but at the same time we are innovating. And I'm not particularly convinced of the IP innovation link as of now. Some years ago, even the university industrial linkages context, I was comparing Institute of Science with NCL in Pune. And if you look at their patent portfolio, NCL was way ahead of Institute of Science. They were also doing fairly good in terms of talking to industry, doing work with industry. But as far as the technology commercialization was concerned, whether it was licensing patents or bringing them out through the entrepreneurial route, Institute of Science was doing much better, despite the fact that they had fewer patents and things like that. So and of course, we have been talking about having something equivalent to a Bayh-Dole Act for India. I am not particularly convinced that that will result in significantly more IP-driven kind of stuff. But yes, maybe some years down the line.
I just want to link Rajat's comment with the question on sort of the everyday skill set, if you like, or the ones that will most affect people, not sort of high-level R&D. And one example that really comes to mind, and perhaps policy could be a little bit more strategic, not on IP in the big IP sense, is right to repair. We sort of conceded a lot of ground on the right to repair, trademarks, copyrights, and patents. And I think some of those design features that really speak to the question of engine repair, question of certain phones, but engine repair is turning out to become a very, very big deal, even in countries which are, quite different in terms of intellectual property structure. So I think for India, that is a domain where there has to be some very strategic policy foresight.
Friends, I just want to say one thing. It is true that the government should make policies. It is true the government should put a regulatory environment. Government should do this and that. There's a lot of things that we can do if there is an innovation at a grassroots level. We have entrepreneurs. What prevents us from doing some other things? So, I think we must start acknowledging it's our shortfall, our deficiency that we are not able to do. IP doesn't come into an implement that you want to make for the agro sector. IP doesn't come into things. There are lots of needs, solutions available. Translating that is our problem. And I'm saying our this industry as well as they can be at that extent. Sarkar ko har cheez ke liye lana beyond the point is not worth it. Let's try and do things ourselves. So friends, I'm looking at my watch all the time. How are you guys doing? You want to call it a day? Any more questions? Yes. Can I say that's the last one?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I'm Sharad Mahajan from NGO. We have done amazing progress after early 90s. A lot of things have changed. So the main issue is employment, and one can also observe the fundamentalism increasing. My question is Gandhi, that is Mahatma Gandhi, relevant today?
We'll have to have a separate session for that, I think, because I think all of us can. Now, I think the point you're raising is relevant. I don't think we would get into the solution. Even if Mahatma Gandhi was there, he would have customized his own opinion even today. That's all I can say on this.
So there was a book that Jiten, who's sitting in the crowd there, actually introduced me to. It's called the Technological Indian, where they talk about even Mahatma Gandhi being very particular about the wheel, the spindle, all of that, and being very technologically sound. So he is still relevant today in that sense.
Okay, I think I would like to once again thank the members of my panel. Thank you so much. Appreciate your time. Thank you, Symbiosis. You guys are so good, even organize a good weather here. It's so pleasant. Thank you so much for doing all this. And yes, thank you. And a great start for the next 2 days. All the very best, Jyoti, and thank you.
Thank you everyone for sharing your thoughts. I'm sure there are many takeaways for all the academicians, students, industry professionals present here. We can definitely carry forward these conversations over dinner. But before that, may I request our director, Dr. Jyoti Chandiramani, to kindly felicitate all our dignitaries on the dais. We'll start with Dr. Pradeep Bhargav. Sorry, I'm sorry, Mr. Pradeep Bhargav. Dr. Rakesh Basant. Professor Smita Srinivas. Dr. Sunil Mani. And Mr. Janak Nabar. May I now request ma'am to propose the vote of thanks.
I think you have to suffer me for 2 minutes more. Well, thank you everyone, and thank the weather for being good. Sorry the winds were hustling and the winds were roaring, but that just is a great beginning for a conference. And a curtain raiser, we knew it was all open, it was just that we needed an occasion to have you here, Pradeep. So, usko ye naam de diya ki curtain raiser hai. FECO is something that we decided, has to happen because we felt that the School of Economics has to have some direction in which it's moving. A decade is over. So the first decade was really kept for concentrating on academics. And the next decade we are going to move from academics, and of course research has already started, but we felt one of the areas of research has to be human capital, and therefore whether you call it jobs, you call it employment, and whatever other tracks that we put in, I thought it's going to have a lot of inputs with us. This whole event would have been very incomplete if we had not got the permission from the Chancellor, the Vice Chancellor, the Pro-Chancellor to have this particular event. And FECO went through its round of Board of Studies and talking at Dean's meeting before it got approved. And I think I have to thank the higher authorities for allowing the situation to, for this event to nurture and come up. Rakeshji, you talked about university linkages with industry, and that's exactly what we are doing. I mean, you're here, we are here, Jamal is here, industry like Steer, Naushad Forbes in his own way with his think tank. We have Pradeepji, who's been a mentor to Symbiosis. I think it's this kind of linkage that we want to weave through and move ahead. As you rightly said, we are a multidisciplinary university, and we move in that direction. I want to thank each one of you, and just want to say a few things. Sunil ji, when you were talking about robos, in 1980s, I think Anita and I, when we would come to work at Symbiosis, we would negotiate buses filled with Bajaj Auto, Bajaj Tempo, and Telco people moving. Now, of course, robos have replaced, and we see buses, and we see Metrozip, and we see the people going in these buses today are going to the IT sector. So you've seen this sheer shift, when you look at the economics from the common man's eye. So we've seen this happen from 80s to 2018 that we're talking about. Janak, the fact that R&D needs to be talked about, and we feel even if it's frugal, it reminds me of a person that I have always loved reading his book, and I keep going back to it, which is Navi Roju, who talks about think frugal, be flexible, and generate breakthrough growth. We know there are limits to growth, but I don't think there are limits to innovation. And there's one person here who's here because of his technological and social innovations, and that's none other than Pradeep ji, who's here. I'll tell you, I think those of us who are Punekars know him because of the zero-load bottle shed, that he had come up with. And Pradeep ji, we salute to you because he keeps saying never depend on government. You have to find your own solutions. And when Pune was in darkness, he worked with 33 industries in Pune to see how they could they could get out of the demand for electricity at that point and see that same supply is distributed to households, and we were able to overcome this, and the zero load shedding model is his baby, and he's here. I think he deserves a big applause for this. Smita, I'm not going to forget the 4 C's. And I particularly liked the slide on those innovations which are in urban, because that's where I come from, and I know you're at IIHS and you're working on that. I think we're going to connect more on this, and thank you for being here. And I think the socio-technological innovations which has participation and some kind of solutions to the economy and better livability is exactly what we are looking at. So it's not necessary always, as you talk about it, as patents, but maybe innovations even in ordinary day-to-day living is what it is. So on this, great occasion, I want to thank all my colleagues. I want to thank all my guests out here who've come today from across Pune, and all of you wonderful people who've come here to make it great. And thanks the weather. Pune seems to be on the Mercer's index for good reasons. And that's it. Thank you, everybody.
Just a moment, please. Rajiv sir. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.